Thank you very much, Lofton, for that introduction, and to the coordinators of the conference for inviting us. Tim and I are really excited to be speaking with you today. Um, I also want to give Tim a lot of credit for the wonderful image that you're seeing right now. Tim, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about the image and how it came to be. I don't know if you were on, but it had a bit of a reaction when people saw it for the first time. So,
Simply put, it is an AI generated image fed in a prompt describing the talk we were giving, and this is the image that was generated. So there you go. It's a foreboding future, perhaps from AI's perspective.
thanks, Tim. That's actually a running theme throughout the presentation. You'll see at various points how we've integrated AI at certain components of the presentation. We're just going to get started here. And this is an agenda. This is what Tim and I are going to cover today. We're going to talk a bit about
Oh,
how we actually entered this
Cecile,
con. Oh,
I
sorry.
don't think it's not showing you the right window. It's just
Oh, is it
showing you
not?
the first
Okay.
slide still.
The first
Yeah.
slide. Let's see.
And while Cecile is navigating that, I'll just take the opportunity to say thank you for the invitation. And it is an honor to be speaking with you all today. I've been sitting in on sessions throughout the first couple of days, and they've been really great. My work life overlaps really well with like what the Library Publishing Forum does. So I got a lot of leads on what to do and things to explore afterwards. So thanks for that.
And let me know if the agenda slide is showing now.
Still not,
Still not.
unfortunately. Do you
Oh,
want me to
okay.
take a crack at it?
Sure, sure. Let me stop sharing.
Just to save the time here so we can use it. Okay. So I hope this shows a little bit better. Let me see if I can modify this even a touch more.
Tim, can you enable the speakers version? I don't know from your end. Maybe that was the problem.
Oh, this guy. Does this look right?
It does. If you want to see
Okay.
if you can go to the next slide.
Hey,
Yeah, there we go.
That'll work. Perfect.
Yes.
Okay. Super.
Well done.
Okay. Task
Okay,
one
thanks everyone.
accomplished.
Appreciate your patience. So Tim and I are going to be speaking about a number of things today, but this is what we're hoping to cover in our agenda. So we're going to talk a little bit about how we actually entered this space, because Tim and I are not AI apologists. We are not AI proponents, but we sort of entered the space in an interesting kind of way. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. We're going to talk about the library labor context, which is originally, I think, sort of our interest in this topic, and a little bit about the concept of the death of the author in an AI world. And we're going to sort of transition this conversation to what we are going to refer to as the blob theory, which we'll talk a little bit about later. We're going to talk about some implications for the research life cycle, which is, I think, a key interest for many of you attending the conference today. And then we're going to close with what do we think we can do about this, if anything? So that's sort of an open question that we'll be working through throughout the session. So next slide, Tim, thanks. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how Tim and I entered this conversation, because it's a little bit of an interesting story. So next slide is fine. So this is a final report that was created by the Ontario Council of University Libraries. And I know that we're speaking not to a totally Canadian audience. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about the Ontario Council of Universities, which is our member-based consortium of academic libraries here in Ontario, Canada. Tim and I are both librarians who work in the province of Ontario in Canada. And it's a member-based consortium, like many consortiums that many of you folks will have in your own sort of local context. And Scholars Portal is sort of the service arm of OCOL, and it provides a shared technology infrastructure and shared collections for the 21 university libraries in the province. And this is a final report, the OCOL Artificial Intelligence Machine Learning Report and Strategy, that was sort of shared in draft format last spring. And this has since been, earlier in the year, and then a final report later on. And it proposed a number of projects for OCOL to take on related to machine learning and AI. And those projects were on a number of different themes, such as government documents, accessible materials, audio to text, building capacity, and also the chat reference component of one of the proposed projects. And that's really what we're going to be speaking about today, because that was what got the most reaction from the library community in Ontario and in Canada generally. So we'll talk a little bit more about that aspect of the project. And yeah. Oh, yes, we are here. So this is what we call the relevant excerpts that freaked some people out. So one of the projects related to chat reference, where one of the services that OCOL provides is a service called Ask a Librarian Chat, which is, I think, probably similar to most chat reference services that many of your libraries or library communities may provide. We provide live chat research help to users in any of our 21 library partners who've joined the service. So it means that we end up answering questions not only for the patrons at our home institutions, but also the institutions at the partner institutions. And we work with a company called Library Help, H3LP or Library Help. And one of those projects was to partner with Library Help, which is in the process of developing a separate VR chat product. And OCOL had been asked to provide logs, so the service logs for the conversations and chats that we have with our users for training and to help them beta test the development of their own virtual reference product, which was ultimately to be a chatbot owned by Library Help, but that had been trained on real live university website data, interactions. And the objective was not necessarily to begin using the chatbot right away, but to participate in its development and then perform an analysis to determine whether it actually could do the job, right? Could it provide the same level of service that our Ask a Librarian service could provide, which uses obviously live operators, myself included, as well as a number of colleagues across the province. In the final report, one of the things they identified was that the tool needed to be human mediated, which you're going to see is a consistent theme throughout discussions about AI, that there need to be a human mediated presence, needed to give some high quality responses and have some sort of information literacy objectives embedded. So once this draft report was shared with the community, it had a bit of a reaction. I think we can go to the next slide. And this is really how Tim and I became involved in the conversation. There was some conversation and chatter on a academic librarian listserv here in Canada. And you can see on the screen some of the timelines of how Tim and I got involved in the conversation. Shout out to my colleague, Jane Schmidt, who actually asked one of the sort of really interesting questions on the listserv, which was, why are we so eager to outsource one of our core functions to bots on our own dime? Invest in people, please, not bots. And we can see Tim's response. And this is a response I think that was echoed by a lot of people on that thread, that we can collectively and rightly say no to having our labor subsumed. But what is the alternative? And one of the things that Tim identified that might be a source of inspiration for us, for those of us who felt that this was a problem, was to look at what the Screen Actors Guild and the Writers Association did fairly recently in the United States when they were trying to negotiate and bargain language around the uses of AI in film and television. Many of you will remember that there was a fairly long strike. This is one of the big issues, and ultimately one of the wins for the Writers and the Actors Guild was to have some kind of language that would protect their presence and their labor in their industry. And Tim was sort of surmising that having similar language for librarians in our collective agreements here in Ontario and Canada, many of our academic libraries have collective agreements that sort of govern our relationship between us and the employer, and that protections against AI might be the next big win labor has to make. Jane and I sort of continued the conversation offline and sort of felt that this was something that we really needed to explore. And for various reasons, Jane couldn't continue in the sort of the conversation, but really felt that Tim and I should continue the work. And that's what we did. So the next slide is sort of the outcome of our work. So this is just a screenshot from a short piece that Tim and I wrote for the CAUT, which is the Canadian Association of University Teachers. They have a bulletin, a newsletter that comes out fairly regularly, targeted to the sort of professors, academic librarians, other kinds of academic members of the sort of broader community. And this was the piece. So we wrote a commentary on AI protections for librarian work, suggesting that it needs to be put into the collective agreement. And a bit later on in the session, Tim and I will actually share some of the language that we included in that piece that we felt was going to be possibly something that we may need to look to in the not too distant future. Okay, next slide. So one of the things that we want to explore, and you're going to really see throughout the presentation, is what we're sort of calling the human in the loop defense, which is something that we see in a lot of literature around AI usage and incorporation of AI, not only in sort of library, university contexts, but also in other contexts as well. And the human in the loop defense merely sort of suggests that we must continue to have a human operator involved in the process to override AI should it make a mistake. And you can see a couple definitions here. The first one is actually an AI-generated definition, which is included in a book on AI and pathology. But basically that it allows humans to modify the output of the system, and it involves their input in simulations, basically to help improve the responses of the AI tool. And then the sort of more simple definition below, which is actually written by a human in the loop machine learning is a set of strategies for combining human and machine intelligence in AI. And the goals of having the human in the loop are, not only to ensure that there's an opportunity to override if there's a mistake, if the AI has created some sort of mistake, but also to involve humans in order to increase the accuracy of whatever the tool you're creating, whatever its objectives are, to reach accuracy much more faster, and to combine the power of human and machine intelligence to maximize accuracy. So you're going to see that this is a consistent hallmark in any sort of writing or language or any sort of research around AI, is that there's this consistent call to make sure that there is a human in the loop, that it's human mediated in some way. And as we sort of work throughout the presentation, you're going to see that Tim and I are going to start to question whether this is sufficient. Okay, next slide. So why does this matter to our librarian community? Why is it important? And more importantly, why is librarian work particularly vulnerable? Because Tim and I feel that there are some qualities and characteristics about librarian work that make us particularly vulnerable. Number one being that we often do our work out in the open. And by out in the open, I mean it's freely available online. This includes things like the content in our open repositories, any of the instructional content that we create, any sort of archival work that we make available online. That's a key sort of goal, I think, of most libraries, is to try and make the information as available as possible. And Tim, if you're able to open up that link to LibGuide, this is just a LibGuide that a colleague of mine has created, Lisa's a law librarian. And this is very typical of what we do as libraries, right? We provide materials online to make it easier for our users to know how to do things. In this case, this is Lisa's guidance on how to note up legal cases. This is freely available. Anyone is able to find it, and that makes it particularly vulnerable because there's no barrier to this being crawled for, and for any AI tool who's trying to learn how to support someone with noting up cases on what the best practices would be. And again, as libraries and librarians, this is what we do. We try to make as little barrier as possible to our users accessing this information, but that also makes us vulnerable. The other aspect that makes librarian work particularly vulnerable is the reference interview. And for those of you who work in reference contexts, you will remember, or maybe this is your experience right now, is the importance of the reference interview, which is sort of the exchange and the question answer context that we use in order to help our users, right? Whether it's at a desk or whether this is happening online. And this question answer engagement really is mimicked in a chatbot interaction. For those of you who have already interacted with other kinds of AI chatbots, things like ChatGPT or Microsoft Copilot, any of these kinds of tools. A lot of these tools are now starting to be embedded in some of the library resources that we subscribe to. You will understand what we mean in terms of asking it a question, getting a response, asking another question to sort of modify the answer. And that actually is mimicked very well in a chatbot interaction. We're living a bit in a post-reference world where we can now get that level of engagement from AI, not only from humans, right? Not only from librarians. Many of our users are likely already interacting with chatbots in this way. The other thing that makes us particularly vulnerable, which is no surprise to anyone attending this conference, is that libraries are perpetually cash-strapped. We're generally broke or in a situation where we need to scale back resources. And there's obviously going to be a large appeal for administrators to purchase a product or tool versus investing in the labor of people. That might seem like a cynical statement, but I think it's probably a realistic statement, particularly in sort of the neoliberal environment that we've been existing in for quite some time, and we don't have a sense that that's going to be changing anytime in the future. And our sort of piece in the CAUT bulletin sort of imagines that in the not too distant future, we may need to bargain protections similar to the language won by writers and screen actors guilds in the US. And we'll take a look at that language a little bit later. Okay, next slide. And so for the community that's here today, many of you work in sort of scholarly publishing environments, and we did want to speak specifically to your labor, because there are some aspects of the labor behind scholarly publishing that also make it vulnerable in other ways. Namely that this labor is often invisible, right? All of the work that happens behind the scenes for digital humanities projects or journal publishing, hosting, repositories, this is often invisible, not only to your users, but also sometimes within your own libraries as well, which makes it particularly vulnerable to machine learning and other kinds of AI tools. Also, scholarly communication support at libraries can be very uneven and it can be precarious, right? It's for many libraries still considered an emerging area of support, perhaps not as well supported as other sort of core functions like collections or reference, which means that you may not have as many people supporting this kind of work, which means that it might be particularly vulnerable to use of AI tools to sort of shore up those areas where there's not as much support, often understaffed. There's a couple of sort of interesting papers or resources that talk about these kinds of issues. Yoon-hee Lee's paper entitled Invisible Labor of Digitizing really looks at how labor has been overlooked or devalued in archival and digital humanities work, looking particularly at spaces like Google Books and Internet Archive. As well as this piece in Nature, Let's Talk About the Volunteers in Scholarly Publishing, where the author really tries to codify all of the different ways that the research life cycle depends on volunteerism, right? So colleagues reviewing your work, journal editorial staff doing, volunteer service work, as journal editors, or doing peer review, again, something many of us do off the side of our desk, as well as the work of registering and presenting in conferences. All of this is done often off the side of our desk and is volunteer labor, right? And that, again, makes it particularly susceptible to AI tools who may actually be able to do a lot of this work, or are purported to be able to do a lot of this work, where there may not be the human labor available to do it and to do it well. Okay, next slide. So I want to talk a little bit about AI and its impact on authorship, because this sort of comes back to I think the main thrust of our presentation, and sort of the beginning image, which really talks about AI's impact on authorship. And the next image might be something familiar to you. It was definitely an image that evoked a lot of memories for me. For anyone who did literary studies or criticism, perhaps in a former life, might recall this really seminal text by Roland Barthes called "The Death of the Author." In particular, this imprint was a very popular imprint when I was a student in university. I want to give a shout out to Johnny Soroker, who's the AI ethics lead at Google, who recently did a presentation at my institution and used this image, which really sort of sparked some things that Tim and I wanted to explore in this session. In particular, Roland Barthes talks about what he calls the death of the author, and the idea that the modern author is really more of a scripter, a copier of texts, who's really just doing mashups and mixing on existing quotations and existing types of culture. So it's not really creating anything new. It's more similar to the function of the medieval scripter. So it's really a challenge to sort of existing literary criticism at the time. And essentially, Barthes is sort of asking the question, how can we know what the writer intended? The writing is detached from the author. The interpretation of the text is more important than the intentions of the author itself. Hence the death of the author. And this is sort of the use of the Grim Reaper image on this imprint, as well as the one that we used in our opening slide, because we feel like, again, there's very similar to sort of Barth's argument, are we now in an age where we're seeing another kind of death of the author? Next slide. And this argument is actually sort of extended in a really interesting book by John Potts called Near Death of the Author, Creativity in the Internet Age. And essentially what he's doing is extending Barth's argument to sort of the AI world, asking some really big questions about authorship, such as, what then of the author? Do the author, composer, and artist face extinction, their social functions entirely replaced by AI? If works of art, even novels and music compositions, can be created by AI systems to the standard of works by human authors, will this achievement render human authors obsolete? So that's a quote from Potts' book. And one of the sort of central issues that he talks about is issues around copyright, right? And arguments against attaching copyright to AI because it does not have the same incentive to create that humans do. This is one of the sort of the underlying principles of copyright. This is sort of an interesting observation in the book, is that AI systems do not suffer from information overload, sleep deprivation, or the other distractions that humans are susceptible to and require an incentive to overcome. So that's sort of one argument, that AI does not deserve copyright, but there are some commentators out there that feel that it should, and that that there should be some sort of public domain model for AI creations. And some people are proponents of a joint authorship where the copyright exists between the human prompter as well as the AI system. There are some other really interesting examples recently of how AI is perhaps seen to be supplanting human authorship. Some of you might be familiar with the recent experience of the National Novel Writing Month, sometimes called NaNoWriMo, which was an annual event for many, many years that encourages people to write a novel in the span of a month. So it's a nonprofit organization that is unfortunately has since, I believe, shut down, citing a number of reasons, not only this sort of AI controversy that I'm going to speak about, but they essentially published a statement that appeared to endorse the use of AI to write a novel as part of the month's activities, which led many board members to step down, criticisms from many people in the creative community. Their argument essentially from a Wired article sort of sums it up. Quote, "The platforms are unethical. The tech scrapes content from published authors without paying royalties or fees, and it robs writers of the opportunity to find their own voice and learn from mistakes," end quote. NaNoWriMo initially defended its position, saying that to condemn AI would be to ignore classist and ableist issues surrounding the use of technology. They sort of modified their position afterwards, but unfortunately, I think the damage was done at that point in terms of their sort of initial support of the use of AI. And then finally, the image on the right is from an Atlantic magazine article that was shared quite widely in the library community, at least here in Canada, which is basically an expose into Meta's pirating of millions and millions of books and papers to train its own AI tool. And they provided a link to a searchable database where you could check to see if your work had been used. And I did check, and mine had been used to train its AI tool. So these are all sort of examples of how AI is really challenging our concept of authorship and having us rethink what it means to be an author and how that will ultimately impact some of the work that we do going forward. And I think, Tim, I pass it over to you at that point. Is that correct?
Awesome. Yep, I think that's the case. So Cecile, hello everyone again. Cecile has done a great job of going over some key fundamental sort of considerations that brought us to where we are today in our thinking about AI, et cetera. Though, as we think and ponder and hypothesize, the world continues. And just to sort of shed really specific construct a very specific case study of something that's actually happened. I'm sure you might have seen or have heard, particularly this crowd, with responsibilities having to do with scholarly publishing. There was this beg, borrow, and steal kind of thing going on with the libgen use, but also academic publishers are negotiating contracts and deals with different publishing organizations to get, content harvested or to prepare content so that can be harvested in the creation of LLM tools. So it's not necessarily foregoing copyright. They're in fact licensing the material, right? So this is, if not not another resounding case study for why open access is good, this is, there can't be more clear version of this. So effectively, Taylor and Francis negotiated some sort of deal with Microsoft so that Microsoft could harvest their content and include it into some platform that it was generating, right? This was unbeknownst to me until after the fact, as that I recently published a book chapter in a book published by Routledge, which was owned by Taylor and Francis. So I turned to my editor and asked, "Did you know this was going to happen?" And the editor, no, of course not. We don't own the material. We just got a copy of the book when it was done. And, Routledge did what it wanted with the content more generally. So there is this current of, let's enrich these AI tools which way we can. But that also includes sort of what happens when you don't have, when a publisher who's motivated by money owns the copyright to your materials. They're not going to, hesitate a moment if the price is right to get a little bit of extra revenue for licensing content into an AI platform. So this whole, and all this to say, this goes beyond sort of just what's in, not just the library context. We deal with information and published works and helping those processes happen. However, there are AI, pressures falling upon other organizations and sectors and organizations in the workforce. So anyone, the Canadians in the audience might be more familiar with this story, as Shopify is a company that's kind of like a technology darling success story from Canada. Recently, the CEO of the company made a statement that, well, it was a memo that went out to the employees of the organization that was eventually picked up by different news organizations, which was very sort of bullish on AI. So a sort of proclamation went out. What we're going to do is utilize AI for things first. And if you need to hire a human to do some sort of task, you really need to rationale or explain why you need a human as opposed to an AI, right? And to a lesser extent, we see a similar kind of push. And once again, for the Canadians in the room, this might sound a little bit familiar. The federal government within our country really is focusing on the implementation of and use of AI products as almost like a primary method to increase productivity of workers, right? So you'll hear lots of stories, and if you particularly know anyone working within the federal government, in the Canadian context at least, there is always a big push to try this with AI first and then see what happens afterwards, or sort of, augment it after you try AI. So I think our narrative here and our trajectory and our theoretical view on this is sort of starting to morph a little bit, right? So what we would like to propose is that AI truly sort of turns into something like a blob. If y'all remember the the sci-fi movie from the 50s where there was this gelatinous, undulating, visceral blob that just sucked up and accumulated and got larger and just incorporated everything that it came across into its own sort of mass and heap. And, those of us not, can remember on the playground, we had a very similar sort of game, like you would play a game of tag. And then as you tag more people, you form this blob that then has to tag all the others as well. And then in the end, you have this big mass, which doesn't really do anything because it's not agile enough. It doesn't move quickly. It just sort of undulates from here to there. And then to bring it home to, in the Blob, the movie, there was no real way to get rid of it except to freeze it. And, that's providing that as long as Antarctica will stay cold. And of course, the little joke we can have amongst ourselves is that, climate change is destroying any kind of idea of something cold enough to freeze the blob. But I think this is a good way to sort of visualize or conceptualize the way AI sort of, it's not The technological positivists will say sort of this very sleek augmentation to our work, and it exists in the cloud, and we can wear a little pin that takes pictures of things and AI interprets them for us. I think that's maybe a naive, optimistic view of things. I think the idea of the undulating blob is a more of a apt metaphor to describe the way AI and AI tools are progressing with respect to all the stuff we've talked about with absorbing the labor of librarians and other information professionals. Right. So, of course, all of this is to prompt some of these questions. Can AI be stopped? Well, I doubt it. The blob continues no matter what. Secondly, do we even want it to be stopped in the first place? And probably not. I think we all have various levels of comfort with AI, but will it continue to envelop us all? It'd be very hard and contradictory for me to say no, or that I would move against that kind of thing, because I've used AI, for example, just to put some components together for this presentation, right? And then if it does sort of continue and envelops us all and it can't be stopped, can we somehow affect it? What ways can we actually make a meaningful change upon the undulations or the composition of this blob? So this leads me to ask, or to focus in on a bunch of considerations for us in the room here about scholarly communications and AI. Right. So as said, as the presentations this week have talked about and demonstrated in our other talks here, we're all scholarly communication people. We're involved in this world. We advocate for open. Some of us run repositories. We help journals get created. We make sure the metadata associated with those materials are available and up and running and accessible to all. Then do we in fact use, or do you in fact use AI in your daily life, and how? If not, after sitting in on some sessions for this conference, are you planning to do so into the future? Or more generally, perhaps more impactfully, do you have policies on AI use? Do you even have a stated preference or a viewpoint that's defensible to justify sort of what kind of actions you might take on, or what kind of services you might offer to your community, right? So Cecile has introduced this idea already, so I won't belabor it too much. But I will sort of say that, the AI companies are already harvesting our content. So we saw the idea of, LibGen, we saw the idea of licensed through, academic output licensed by AI companies. But then here's the kick in the pants that we probably didn't anticipate. All of the work we've done to make things open and open access and readily available are, beautiful setups for AI harvesting, right? So on the screen here, I encourage you to take a look at it if you haven't really explored it before. But there's a tiny little text file you can put on your website called robots.txt. And that will it gives permission to different harvesters to come and look at your website. So if you're running an instance of OJS, you're running a platform or some digital humanities sites, have a look at what robots.txt has to say, and you'll see sort of what the allowable harvesting usage is already for your platforms. This is from our digital repository, or I should say Brock's digital repository, and it's not exclusive, or doesn't exclude harvesting from AI platforms. The other thing I'll mention is we used to have our repository hosted in a third-party site, which we had to pay bandwidth for. And one time they came back with a nice large extra bill because of increased bandwidth usage, which was due to OpenAI harvesting the heck out of our repository. So it's not just an anecdote I'm talking about casually. It is, in fact, something that has given us a material cost and sort of a bit of labor and work to investigate. So I'll hand it over to Cecile. Please go for it.
Thanks, Tim. So the next part of the presentation, we're just going to talk about some other instances that I think will be relevant to this audience around AI tools and scholarly publishing. This is an image from a really interesting article that was published earlier this year on ethical guidelines for the use of Gen AI tools and scholarly publishing, a thematic analysis. And what they did was they had a look at 10 of the major academic publishers. So Wiley, all of the, IEEE, all of the folks you would expect to see. And one of the things that they analyzed was their AI policies and to see what was considered acceptable use and what was considered unrecognized use. And what you're sort of meant to get from this image is sort of the lack of consistency on many of these policy issues. In fact, I think the only item that gets a 10 out of 10 is that none of the major publishers are comfortable yet listing AI as an author or co-author. But other than that, you can see sort of scattered across the 10 what some of them will allow and what many of them will not, which sort of leads to, I guess, the conclusion that there's not a lot of consistency in this environment yet, especially amongst our major publishers. And that's a problem, right? That's something that many publishers collectively are going to have to determine because it's creating a really complex and confusing landscape for authors and potential publishers. Next slide. This is actually an editor's statement that was published in a bioethics journal. So a bunch of journal editors got together and sort of made a statement on responsible use of Gen AI in scholarly publishing. And this quote is really interesting because I think it gets to the crux of the problem is that even though they believe Gen AI may pose a threat to the goals that animate our work, they also believe it could be really valuable at achieving those goals, right? So some of the recommendations that they propose really lean heavily on the human in the loop defense, right? That editors and reviewers should not rely solely on Gen AI to review paper submissions, retaining humans as sort of the final arbiters in the process, and that editors should retain final responsibility for selecting reviewers, still exercising oversight over that task. So that's a sort of a similar sort of argument than many that we've seen before, that we need to continue to include humans because we need to have that human in the loop defense should AI not do the job. Okay, next slide. This is a really interesting study for the metadata folks in the audience. This is an article where they undertook a study to see what ChatGPT would offer them in terms of creating metadata. So this is a prompt that was fed into ChatGPT, basically asking it to summarize an interview that could be used as a description field in a Dublin Core metadata field, and then export the transcript. And one of the sort of interesting conclusions they reached is that they showed both a human created version and an AI generated version to research participants, and many preferred the AI generated description of these oral histories that they were trying to sort of classify and catalog. And they preferred that version to the human generated one, which is really interesting. And the article sort of suggests some of the future issues that this could create, right? If we become reliant on AI tools to be creating metadata, we're probably going to erode those kinds of skills, which have already been eroded in our library community. So just sort of further hastening that erosion, and obviously still the potential for bias and hallucination if we're allowing it to create metadata fields for us. And this is another interesting study that looked at potential AI usage in peer review. So the research was trying to sort of examine the extent to which they felt AI chatbots may have modified the peer reviews of conference proceedings submitted at some computer science meetings. And one of the things they looked for is some of the buzzword adjectives and hallmarks of AI written text. There's been a lot of sharing of information on how you can sort of identify AI written text. Many of us have already gotten, I think, pretty good at identifying that. And their analysis sort of suggested that perhaps up to 17% of the peer review reports potentially were modified by chatbots, although it's unclear whether it was researchers using the tools to construct these peer reviews from scratch or improving written drafts. And this is an interesting quote, which I think is probably pretty true, is that it seems like when people have lack of time, they tend to use tools like ChatGPT, right? We see that amongst our students probably as well, but there's obviously huge copyright implications. If we're giving tools access to confidential research data, unpublished research data, there are some real implications there for releasing this information to AI before it's even formally gone through the peer review process. And back to Tim, I believe.
So I just wanted to take an opportunity here to do like another case study. So we just heard about a few academic studies sort of surveying the environment and some consequences of the introduction of AI into the scholarly publishing life cycle. But the other thing I wanted to sort of draw a really fine point on, for those of you in the room that support the publication of OJS or of journals hosted on the OJS platform, are probably intimately familiar with this screen, right? So you have the out of the can OJS system that takes submissions. And just recently, let's say within the past year, some of the editors that I work with at Brock University are curious about, I think there's some AI coming in for submissions in these journals. How can we mitigate that or investigate that more closely? Fortunately, unfortunately, at around the same time, my institution picked up a subscription to a platform called iAuthenticate, and it's created by the same people that create the Turnitin platform. Except with iAuthenticate, it's more of a interactive platform that doesn't necessarily harvest all the content that you give it, right? So if you have a series of papers, you submit to Turnitin as part of a class, that becomes part of the corpus. I think one of the key selling things with Authenticate is that it is standalone, more or less, right? But see, here's what happens when we implement Authenticate and put it into the OJS workflow. We confront the author with a necessity to accept a EULA for a platform that they're not even, probably seen before. But when they do, reticence aside, the necessity and pragmatism of, publishing sort of, I think, drives the process more than anything. An author will agree to whatever sort of restrictions journals are implementing and asking for, and then submit their work. On the other side, this is what happens when an editor then looks at the OJS platform once Authenticate has been enabled, and it gives sort of an inline summary of its results. And here we have a very sort of strong indication of 100%. So what does, in fact, this stuff mean? As I mentioned, I had access to iAuthenticate through my institution. And what I did is I went and I uploaded a paper that I submitted to a journal and didn't get accepted. But the one thing I will say is that I wrote the paper myself. I didn't, consult AI at all, and submitted it to this platform to sort of see what it had trouble with, right? So much like, a nice marked up thing, you can navigate through the document you've submitted to the platform, and then it'll give you sort of indication and information about where the overlap was and what things it looks for that are suspicious. Now, I won't read out all these texts, these little snippets of text explicitly, but I will say it's very sus. So, there's 5, 6 words, not continuously the same, pretty generic in flavor, yet the platform is identifying that as a cause for concern. So in my case, with this paper, all told, these levels of suspicion were only at a total of a 3% sus score, I guess is how you would interpret that. But, this is one little examination of a paper that I know shouldn't have any kind of um, sus score associated with it. What happens en masse when editors are relying on this number to accurately reflect or to make the decisions about what they want to publish out of their journals? What is the magic number in this kind of quantitative assessment environment? Anything under 10 is okay, anything under 40 is okay, anything short of 90 is fine. It's really, really weird, and it's coming for us, or it's already part of the tools that we're putting together. And you can imagine commercial publishers are already investigating this kind of stuff and have their alternative platforms where they're coming up with little numbers that kind of describe exactly how, well the work is or how original it is.
And so this leads Tim and I to ask the question, which we've sort of been building towards, which is it enough? Is it this human in the loop defense enough for the work that we do and for society generally? And yeah, well, you can move to the next slide. This is actually a really interesting article by Cory Doctorow, which sort of critiques really the human in the loop defense, I think, in the same way that Tim and I are suggesting, which is, one of the things that Cory talks about is, he argues that people are highly susceptible to, what's known as automation bias, right? Where we tend to rely on systems and machines more than we can rely on ourselves, right? And if we're doing that with AI, and we all do this kind of cognitive offloading in many ways. We all use tools to sort of note-taking tools and other kinds of things. But because of this automation bias, how is it impacting us intellectually in terms of our critical thinking skills? In a labor context, how much is too much cognitive offloading? Dan Davies, who's an economist, wrote a really interesting book called The Unaccountability Machine, where he sort of argues that this sort of cognitive offloading creates what he calls accountability sinks. And essentially, this means systems where decisions are delegated to a complex rule book or set of procedures, and it becomes impossible to identify the source of mistakes when they happen, which means there's no accountability, right? And in our increasingly unhuman world, where lives are dominated by things like algorithms, AI, these accountability sinks don't only just create aggravation, they make life and the economy unknowable and no accountability when things do go wrong.
So then, what do we do, if anything? And being mindful of the time, there's not a we do want to leave at least a few moments for questions, so we won't harp too much upon sort of this last consideration we'll bring to your attention. But maybe one of the things, and this is betraying myself as a socialist and even worse, a Marxist, I think we need to create labor protections that will be de facto, accountable to law, right? So, the reason why we have a weekend and et cetera, et cetera. But if we want to, I think, progress forward in this world where there is actually a backstop that precludes or explicitly stops AI from taking over some component of library labor, is to actually include that language in our collective agreements, similar to that of the Writers Guild and the Screen Actors Guild. You can read these for yourself. I won't, spend the time to read it all out loud. But I mean, one of the things we can do is show solidarity and collective strength. Now, this sort of statement or grandeur might appeal more to Canadians in the audience that are possibly more ensconced in union activity. Certainly, union saturation is higher within Canada, so that's why I say that kind of thing. But, I think the one of the ways we have to defend ourselves is through our employment contracts, seen through our collective agreements. So if we want to make some progressive change or some to take a stand more vocally against the encroachment, or the term used earlier, subsumption of our labor to AI, I think maybe labor action is the way to do it. But we certainly don't want to chew up all the time. So we'll stop there and pose it to you all for questions and conversation. Thank you.